Hello and welcome to another panel at the very beginning of Spotlight Indie's big indie weekend. So today this hour, I am with a lovely raft of raiders across the realms, our Realm Raiders authors and editors, and we're going to be talking about the Realm Raiders project, which is hosted over on the Spotlight Indie website. I'm sure you've seen it and read it and loved it. And we've also got Phil Parker, who was the mastermind and master editor behind all of it as well. So we're going to be talking about that today. So before we dive into our topics of conversation and all that good stuff, let's go around. I've been going clockwise, and I'm going to continue that tradition and just introduce everybody, introduce themselves, and their work, and just a little bit about themselves. So Phil, what do you want to give Phil Parker? I should clarify that. Do you want to give everybody a little intro to yourself, and I suppose your role on the Realm Raiders project as well?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. It's going to be confusing. This is the two Phils. I'll have to change my name. I'm going to be Eric from now on. I'm Phil Parker, and I'm author of a number of sort of dark fantasy novels. Some of them are currently behind me, and I've been writing for some number of years now. Realm Raiders project is part of the Creative Commune. We're a sort of bunch of currently 18 different fantasy authors who all sort of get together every once in a while and sort of do things to have fun, to sort of support one another, stuff like that. And we came up with the idea of writing a story, which rather than turn it into an anthology, which would have been a nice, easy way of doing it, we decided instead to turn it into a novel, which meant that there was a huge amount of coordination, agreeing what the plot was going to be, deciding who the characters were that were going to sort of take place in this story, and that there weren't going to be huge gaping chasms within the plot that everybody would notice as soon as they began reading it. So with all of those problems in mind, we set off to enjoy ourselves. And God knows how we did that, but we certainly sort of seemed to. So that's basically the Realm Raiders sort of project. So I'll hand it over to the rest of the guys to fill in any more gaps that I've obviously missed.
Perfect. And just before we leap over to Simon for him to introduce himself, as part of the Big Indie Weekend, Phil, you mentioned the books behind you there. So I think you're the third bureau of the British Bureau for the Arcane. You're going to have a launch party later at 9 p.m. this evening. It's going to be a live stream thing. So make sure you come along to that and say hello and provide support to Phil and his amazing books.
Please do. Please do. Yeah.
So Simon, do you want to give everybody an introduction for you and what your amazing achievements on the Realm Raiders project?
Yeah, of course. I'm the only Simon on the panel, so that's good. This is my library that I'm sitting in. For sure. I am a science fiction and fantasy writer, so I've written short stories for a long, long time, and then also novels, and I vary between science fiction and fantasy. So probably I won't list them all, but there's more than 10 now. I lose track. We won't delve into characters perhaps, but I was one of the had a character in Realm Raiders. It was a fascinating process. The phrase herding cats will probably be mentioned several times. So we'll come back to that, I'm sure.
I'm sure we will. Patrick, would you like to give an introduction, please?
Yeah, I'm Patrick Samphire. I'm a fantasy writer. I've been writing, again, like Simon, I've been writing quite a while. I think I first published a story in 2002, and I read short stories exclusively for quite a while before switching to novels. I wrote a couple of novels for children before moving on to writing adult fantasy novels. I brought along props here because that's what I do. So first adult fantasy novel. The series is now finished.
It's really good.
It is. Thank you.
It really is.
And so I was on For Realm Raiders, we were split into 3 teams of 3 authors to make it slightly more manageable. I was on the same team as Simon, and it was a very chaotic process. But I think out of the chaos came some really cool and creative things, which we will talk about in detail. And I don't envy being poor Eric there. Your path roll into
remember that now.
have to make it into something coherent with because we basically all just did what the hell we wanted in the end.
Yes, yeah, I definitely don't envy Eric/Phil for his role, although I'm very grateful to him for having done that. Phil Williams, do you want to give us an intro?
Sure. So I'm also an author, surprisingly. I write dark fantasy, sort of, it's kind of genre blending a little bit, dark fantasy thrillers, often contemporary fantasy. My longest series at the moment is the Ordshore series, which is kind of dark fantasy thrillers set in the modern city of Ordshore. And more recently been delving into epic military fantasy with the Blood Scouts series, which is all a lot of fun, very dark, miserable stuff. With a bit of humour in there too. Oh, thank you.
You ought to have to go to the show, Phil, because
I've got a prop too. There. That's the original, the very first book, or first copy, I should say, because I've got a pile of proofs that I need to get rid of there. I'm clearing out my cupboard because I just bought a whole bunch of my books to stock up, and there's a lot of them. So yeah, I've lost count really of how many books I've done, but I've been doing it a while. And I was part of a different group for the Realm Raiders. I was with Damien Larkin and Derek, and we were. I'd say they're probably one of the more irreverent groups, and we had a lot of fun doing it. But I think Patrick's absolutely right. We were kind of doing our own thing, and it's all thanks to Eric/Phil that it came together somehow. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think already we are showing the lovely power of community and authors that we've just gone through a nice introduction, and everybody's already being super supportive and crowing about how good everybody else's books are. So I love that. And just to confirm and show my bias for the panel, that I was also one of the authors on the teams. So my first team was with Frank Dorian and Rachel V. Green, and then I was with Simon and Patrick in the second half as we swapped around. So I think that's also given a nice introduction into the Realm Raiders project. So we started with a group of 9 of us, and then we had these sort of first half and second half and different teams running off. So the project is now complete. So we'll also caveat this with, we've had a chat with this before on the Spotlight Indie channel, but now it's been complete. It's been out for a little while, so I think spoilers are okay. Now, if you want to mention something from the latter half of the story, that's absolutely fine. So the first thing we wanted to touch on was looking back on the project now it's complete. Do you have any lessons learned from this? I imagine, Phil Parker, you might have a few more than the rest of us as we kind of ran off and did our own thing.
Yeah. Never do this again, you mean? Is that the type of lesson? Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't going to say that, but I felt like that might have been maybe the scope was. I mean, as Patrick mentioned, I think it was a very broad scope for it, and it felt very chaotic at times on the front lines and by the on the front lines of the keyboards, and I'm sure it did for you as well, Phil, trying to bring it all together. But I do think it's something it's got the disparate elements have come together really well. So I think that just goes to show how well, Phil, you did bring it together. So has anybody got any lessons that they've learned from this apart from never do it again? Or maybe we'll do an anthology with separate stories next time?
It's a kind of interesting thing, because part of the lesson might be plan better. But on the other hand, I wonder if we planned better, we might have lost some of the creativity in it. I mean, I think the only lesson I would take from it would be to write the whole thing from beginning to end before pinning down, because we kind of did it in 2 parts. We wrote the first half of it, and we kind of edited it, and we locked that in, and then we went on to the second part, at which point I think we would have found it easier if we could have changed some of the plot points in the first half, having them pinned down. And we worked around that and we worked with it, but I think we probably all wouldn't have minded being able to go back and do another edit on the original ones and change a few other things, but it all worked out in the end. So
Yeah, it kind of makes you be a bit more creative in those solutions. If you've already locked that down, you can't just sort of say, "Oh no, he always had that key. He's always been able to open that door." You have to figure out another way around it.
Yeah, I would certainly echo what Patrick said. I mean, I found, because we all wrote 2 chapters effectively, writing the first chapter was so much easier because at that point we were all heading off in 1,000 directions and just having fun. And of course, in the second chapter, when we're pulling everything back together and making everything work out, that becomes a whole lot harder because you have to start thinking about plots and characters and who ends up where. And so I take Patrick's point that if we'd locked it down too much, we'd have lost some creativity. I do feel maybe we tried to do this and it just didn't work out. We maybe agreed like a skeleton plot up front for the whole thing. Maybe, or, not necessarily who goes where and why, but maybe just like they all go here and then they all go here and then they meet here and then this happens. Maybe just as a framework. But I say all that because that's how I tend to write novels. I have a sort of rough idea of the start and the end. And then I just know I've got to get from A to B. Yeah. Whereas we didn't have a B, really.
Yeah. Well, I do think we came up with some of our most interesting ideas when we were kind of brainstorming with half the book done and thinking, well, how are we going to do this? What's actually going on with this? And those kind of discussions, I think, came some of the more interesting things that happened in the latter part of the book. And I don't know whether we would have come up with those if we had pinned it down early. But on the other hand, that's how I write books. I don't plan it out in advance. I kind of stop several times and try and figure out what the hell's going on.
There's also the element that if we had done it the other way, I think you're absolutely right. It would be easier if we'd been able to write it all ahead. But on the other hand, as Simon says, in the second half, it became a lot harder because we needed to tie things together. And if that was still open, I think it might have been more difficult in some elements, because by locking down the first half, we were coming in with, in some cases, all the characters at once. And it was quite handy to have the full first half ready there for us to work with. So there's some pluses and minuses with it. But
there's quite a mundane technical point as well, which I think we would have benefited from, and that's to agree up front where communication happens and where master copies of the stories are. Because quite a lot of the communication was people saying, hang on, I didn't know that had happened. Who said that? And then, because some of it was, there were different channels, there were different versions of things, and it's like, that all added to the fun in many ways, but perhaps a controlling mind just to sort of act as gatekeeper for stuff might have helped a bit.
But on that point as well, I'd say one of the most important things I say to take away from it is how important it is to have someone, at least one person in particular, who's really spearheading the whole thing. Because I think that without Phil, this could very easily have just fallen apart a bit. He was very much driving it, and you need someone there who's really at it. And not just in terms of organising what we were doing, but also keeping us to a schedule and chasing people up about it. He was very diligent with it, and you absolutely need that in a project like this that kind of makes or breaks it.
Yes, it was. It's easy to get distracted by different projects that you've got on separately, and so it was very useful to have Phil be like, by the way, guys, we've got this meeting that we need to sort of start brainstorming stuff, and then you'll need to have X by Y, and that was very handy.
So I just want to introduce you to this little notebook of mine, everyone, because it was in that book that from the very beginning I began to make notes of everything that we were talking about when we met online, and recording everyone's ideas, trying to sort of to make sense of them. So I cannot tell you how chaotic those ideas were in the early stages, and why I think in the end, I'm not sure who it was that suggested that we decided to split the story up into 2 halves, so we could at least get the first half sort of sorted out, and then it was a case of after that, God knows what's going to happen, but we'll have something in place. And so there are pages of really crazy ideas that never saw the light of day, thankfully. But with my little scrawlings of God knows how we're going to make this work, and oh my God, are we serious about this? So there were a lot of really diverse ideas sort of coming out of there. But somehow, I think our online discussions and brainstorming sort of sessions came together really quite smoothly. And to answer your question, Alex, I think what was it that I learned was that I was dealing with a group of 9 people who were so open to what everybody else was doing that there were no egos at play here. There were just lots of people who just wanted to create a really good story and would therefore say, oh, well, if everyone else has said that, that's fine. Let's go with that then in that case. And that made the whole process so much more collaborative, so much more fun, that, you know, the ideas that are in here, you know, sort of, you know, really did tend to get sort of watered down a little bit, perhaps, and weren't quite so crazy. So that's very much the thing that I've learned, is that if you're going to collaborate, you really do need to be open-minded to everyone's ideas and very accepting, really, which is what we were, I think, and that's what made it so much fun.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because as short story writers and novelists, we're really used to working on our own ideas. And, you know, maybe we'll get a bit of feedback from someone on a specific question or whatever. But in general, until we've written it, it's us. And we're kind of experimenting in a way the format that writers' rooms in TV work by, I think. Yeah. And again, they did, you know, having a showrunner who says, right, this is it. This is, you know, directs everyone and you know, finalizes everything and says this is what we got pinned down, is absolutely essential, which is a role Phil did. But we should also say that Phil Parker did write some stuff for it as well. You weren't only an editor.
Yeah, occasionally. Yeah, you can tell the cheap stuff. Yeah. But yeah.
I think for the collaborative thing as well, and adding to the chaos, is when we came to the second part of it. So I ended up doing both the first chapters of the teams that I was doing. And the first team, the second writer was Frank Dorian. So I was expecting at least most of the characters to survive until the end of our 3 chapters, but I'd forgotten that Frank was writing the second one. So I think initially the intention was kind of that everyone would have a character that they, you know, put into, and we in the early discussions that I'd had with Frank and Rachel for our first section, we picked a kind of the 3 people and the kind of the dynamics that they would have. And I think only Ren made it out of those 3 chapters alive. So that helped with the collaborative aspect, because I think Ren was the character that Rachel pitched or was going to sort of take forward. So it was like, well, not that I had a character anyway, but it's like, okay, well, any character that I may have pitched initially is gone now. So I'm all in on everything everybody else is doing. So it was nice to be really open-minded towards that.
I have to say, I can vividly remember reading that chapter of Frank's, and having to go back and read it again, thinking, they've not just killed everybody, surely. You know, the first half of the book, and we've just had 2 people horribly murdered. Oh my God. What do we do now?
I mean, it was good in many ways, because it did simplify the second half of the book.
It made it easier.
Killing people off, you know. So maybe that's
nobody was safe. That everybody could potentially be killed.
That's true. Yeah.
Maybe that's the lesson from it, is kill quite a few characters in the first half to make it easier in the second.
Yeah.
Someone should tell George Martin that he should have killed more of his characters. He might have finished his books by now.
Exactly. So we touched on talking about those lessons learned. So I think we touched on this next point a little bit, but we wanted to ask, like, what can authors take forward from the experience? So what can you take forward from this experience, whether, you know, individually, or if you were going to do this kind of project again? I think Phil would perhaps say never again, tattooed widely on his forehead. But yeah, are there any other... Are there any other things that you would take forward from this? Simon, is there anything that's added to your mind?
The main thing I got out of it as a writer, as opposed to like a reader, was the practice at inhabiting other characters that I hadn't created really. So as we've alluded to, we all created our own characters, and they had wildly different voices, different persona. Some of them I don't think I'd ever have written, as if I'd said, some of Frank's characters, for example. Can't imagine I'd write those. But then in the second half, when we were picking up different characters as well as our own characters, we had to kind of learn to inhabit those other characters and speak and act as they would. So that was quite a fun exercise, I think, trying to get that right. It sort of expanded our minds a bit, or at least it did mine. I don't know what the others think.
Yeah.
I had to learn to swear more.
Yeah,
I think it applies to plotting as well as characters. I think it's a good point, the characters, because we're having to sort of take on different people's personalities a bit. But I think the same with plotting as writers, when we're writing alone, I think we tend to, whether we want to or not, go down a similar sort of path with our writing. Like as a writer, I think everyone tends to have their own thing that they want to say. And I think that will always influence the way you tell a story and where a story goes. And I think when you're working with other people, you realize that actually the story doesn't have to take this route or that route. And someone can kill off your favorite characters.
Yes. You've done what?
Yeah. Kind of related to that, I think there's I think as writers, again, particularly as novelists, we can be a little bit control freaks over our stuff, because we are, this is kind of, you can't be a control freak in something like this. You have to be less precious about the character you wrote and the things you wrote. And I think that's a kind of freeing thing in many ways, because it is, some writers love, for instance, killing off characters, but some of us tend to kill off characters very reluctantly, and because we've got so into the characters, and and this is again, you're handing over the character you've written and the bit of story you've developed to someone else, and if they want to kill them, they'll kill them. And we generally agree on what we're going to do, but not to the extent that your character couldn't die. We kind of agreed what the plot was and where it was going, and maybe how it would be resolved, but we didn't agree that any particular character would survive to the end, or that they would have a satisfactory or a happy end to their story, or anything like that. So, and you kind of, I found it quite easy in some ways to release the characters in that way, in a way that I haven't always felt with my own stuff. So I think as a lesson to that, you just kind of, feel less reluctant to release storylines and characters.
Yeah.
I think doubly so, because we, just as a structure for those two people who haven't read it, we had, say we planned the sort of first half, and then all the characters kind of converged at that point, and then we split out again with our different teams in different chapters. So it was not necessarily the same teams or characters and teams of writers that were going off in the second half. So that definitely, I think, added, for me certainly, that open-mindedness of whatever could happen and not being too precious with anything, to that aspect of it. And I think, talking earlier about whether or not we should have nailed down the whole process, I guess if we hadn't have done that, and said, these characters need to be in X chapters, we wouldn't necessarily have been able to do as much with that second half. Any other things that people wanted to say about things that they might take forward, or that other people could take forward?
I think one of the things for me that was a major plus point when you looked at all of the chapters that were coming in, it was the blend of genres that's made the story so different, so unique. And it was also working with writers who write in those genres. So when you read a really incredibly grimdark chapter that Frank writes, where violence and awful things happen, just as a matter of course, and then you sort of perhaps precede that or follow it with rampant humor from Derek Power, where you've got absolute mayhem loose, and where humour is very much part of the whole thing. And then you've got Rachel's sort of chapters where you've got romanticy, sort of in there as well. So that it was, I think it was exciting to see how different writers embraced all of those different genres. And as you guys have just been saying, when you're not used to writing in those genres and you're having to bring in those elements, that is a real sort of challenge. I remember someone, and I can't remember who it is, saying to Damien Larkin that one of the things that they really loved about his opening chapter was that they saw him write humour for the first time. And how brilliant it was to see him do that, because the whole of that first sort of 3 chapters were very much sort of embraced about getting high levels of sort of comedy sort of to it. It was those elements that for me made the whole project so exciting to read and to see how it all developed.
Yeah, and I think going along with that is despite that, I thought it was interesting just how coherent the overall story was. And because although people were writing these different things, a lot of this is character based. Some characters are fairly dark people, others have a very sharp sense of humor, others have very positive outlooks, but they're all kind of interacting with the same world and at the same time. So although they're we could put them under different subgenres or genres, in effect they all fitted within this world and they fitted together really well, I thought. And that was kind of interesting. But I think it also challenged, like you say, some of us to write things that we don't normally write. For instance, I ended up writing part of my chapter as a kind of heroic high fantasy, which is not something I would normally write. I don't tend to write that kind of very traditional heroic hero. But as I had inherited a character who was that kind of one, I had to put them in that, and it was a fun challenge to do these kind of different things.
To that point, I think it was really impressive how they all came together in terms of style, that they flowed, not just the story and the characters, but the style. It kind of neutralizes out to a degree that it's the same story, and you could feel like it's one flowing story, and it wasn't like each chapter was in a different style. I mean, there were certainly elements that were a bit different, but it did work together.
Leading on from that was I found it was interesting for me as a writer how my experience as a reader of the earlier chapters fed into my writing of the later chapters. So, I wrote my character Maureen as a sort of slightly grumpy old man, basically a bit of a cliched wizard in a tower, I suppose. But then after reading all the other chapters and all the other characters, and there's a lot of that which is just quite joyous and youthful and a bit crazy and hedonistic, that fed into how I then wrote the character in the second part, because he was suddenly seeing all this going on around him and sort of thinking, I really missed out on having a wild youth, and so that, So his character sort of acquired depth because of what I, as a writer, had read in those other characters, which I found interesting. So I kind of warmed to him. He was a bit annoying at first, but he was quite moving towards the end, I feel. Yeah.
Okay, so we touched on a lot of things that we can take from it, but are there any moments that you particularly enjoyed from the story as a whole? Do you have a favorite moment or character apart from anyone's characters that you were apart from any characters that you were essential in molding, like Simon, you just mentioned, Morin, you sort of you were the main architect behind him initially. So you're just throwing that out there for any favorite moments throughout the story.
Can I start it off because this one for me remained my favorite. It was a lovely section, and just to preface it, when we began planning the second half of the story, we had got this sort of situation where Damon, in the first half of the story, has his soul trapped inside Rubber Duck, and that we've got sort of someone else who's actually sort of placed him there as a matter of safety, because that's what they can do as a necromancer. We decided that we needed Damien to get out of the Rubber Duck somehow, and we came up with the idea of planting him within one of the stone gods within the temple, because then that way, when it comes to fighting the villain, we've got a really sort of powerful, sort of character there who's going to be stomping around in a stone god, as it were. Derek was responsible for writing that chapter, and I think it's inspired humor on Derek's part that he chose to turn that character into the matron who is carrying a bunch of grapes, and that the only weapon that he's got in order to defeat the baddie is a bunch of grapes, which he calls, the grapes of granite, and that parts of the story involves him plucking individual stony grapes and lobbing them at people in order to try to defeat them. For me, it just picked up this image of this stone sort of person wandering around lobbing grapes at people in order to knock them over. And for me, I just thought that was utterly hilarious. So it completely inverted the purpose of that particular part of the story beautifully. So I thought it was inspired.
And it's that kind of chaos that we had to deal with. It's
yes.
doing that kind of random things. For me, if I was going to choose someone, I think it was because the first part of the book we had heroes in 3 different teams going off in 3 different directions to gain certain artifacts that we were going to need eventually to defeat the big bad. And they all kind of went off. They were quite character focused. They were often focused around the squabbles of the characters. But then when we got to the beginning of the second section, which was I think it was Damien Larkin who wrote the first chapter of the second section, and we got to this place, and then there was this sudden weight of seriousness and this ominous feeling as these characters who have been off, just doing their stuff, are suddenly faced with the reality of what's going on here. And it was a really good change of tone that Damien did in that, and it's kind of a bit of a shiver up the spine type of moment.
Yeah. I was actually going to say a similar point, but much earlier, because I was going to say, actually, I really liked, I think it was your chapter, in fact, Patrick, where we suddenly had this quite epic battle with this giant kind of monster, wasn't it? And because for me, I felt that we got that feeling quite early, because obviously me, Damien and Derek, we'd done quite close and, as we've said, fairly good-humoured opening chapters that gave quite a low-key introduction to the story. And I think it was at that chapter that you did, Patrick, we had this great bit of high epic fantasy kind of action, and it suddenly felt a lot more dramatic, and that this story is going to go somewhere a lot bigger than the way we'd introduced it. It was a really nice jumping off point.
Yeah.
In fact, that was the moment I was going to mention as well, because it felt like, I think I wrote the chapter just before your chapter for that part, Patrick, and I kind of left you in the lurch slightly.
You did.
It was kind of fun to write, but then I kind of regretted it, because I think you then wrote the chapter before me in the second part. So which worked out fine. You weren't. I just kind of threw in this massive robot thing at the end that the sword was somehow tied up with, and just said, well, off you go then, Patrick, you go and sort that out. But I thought that worked really well, because then the world's multiple realms just sort of opened up, because that was a completely different realm. And
but the thing is, if you hadn't thrown that in, none of that big battle would have happened. It would have been probably a much smaller personal quest type of thing. And I think this is part of why we really benefit to have these things that we're thrown with each other. And although we talked about the plotting, this is the kind of thing that everyone did, is, you would write your chapter and then you would throw something in there. Yeah. And it was then the job of the next person who came along to deal with that and to weave it into what they'd been thinking. And different teams wrote the stories in different ways. But the team that Simon and I were in at the beginning, we kind of wrote one after the other. So the first person wrote their story, and then the next one and the next. So we were just throwing things at them, and we'd all kind of thought about our characters and what they were up to. But then you were suddenly delivered with something that you had to feed into your story, and And it did actually make it a lot better as a result. And I guess if you were over planned, you might not get that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think for me, which pulls us on to the next point as well, I had a lot of favourite moments of the fact that there were so many different worlds that we were all visiting, and I just loved the sort of little the depth that people just kind of sprinkled in with all their chapters. I was just sort of refreshing myself on things, and this sort of weight of history and, let's say, geography and vast sense of geography, like Simon, in your chapters you mentioned the Shadow Labyrinth and kind of then the sort of history of this place between worlds, and then that sort of thing. And just as a favorite character, I think I really enjoyed Myra, which is Patrick. I think the character you started off with, as she seemed to be a bit punk rock, a bit in and over her head, but ultimately I think wants to do the right thing, and I really enjoyed her journey going through as well. So one of the next things was, we've also talked earlier about characters not surviving and it being a bit Game of Thrones. So I suppose it doesn't really matter if they did survive, because you could go back and write a prequel, but would you revisit any of these characters, whether with other authors or alone? Are these characters that you want to visit? And I suppose that applies to any of the cast of characters, and I was initially thinking that might apply to the character that you initially pitched, but as we discussed it, everyone sort of became mixed up. So are there any characters you'd like to have a crack at separately and maybe write a different story for them? And Phil, would you like to write any of them? Because you didn't, you wrote a few elements to it, but you weren't one of the authors on the chapters. So
it's interesting you should say that, because I think I found myself, one of the planning sessions, I think quite in the middle of the story, I really did a lot of driving to get Damon to become the traitor within it. And I remember sort of talking about the Traitors being a sort of TV series that was going on at the time. And for me, because I wrote the original sort of opening to it, which focused on a character who would eventually become Damon, I really found myself really quite invested in Damon. I just liked him as a character, that he was so obnoxious and so stupid and easily manipulated, and the kind of character that you just want to have getting into all sorts of stupid sort of situations, dangerous situations, because they're just too stupid to do anything else. And for me, that was what Damon was really like. So being trapped in a rubber duck and then being trapped in a stone sort of a temple god was just perfect for him. It was really what he deserved.
I think Damon was a fantastic character, actually, because he was so obnoxious, and he thought he was so much better than the other characters. And when he was trapped in the rubber duck, of course, he was broadcasting his thoughts and couldn't stop the others hearing thoughts that he was having about them. And he was a really good character. There aren't many characters we could write sequels to, because without going into it too much, not many made it through to the end of the story. I could see myself in a way doing some prequels for my character Myra, because she's been at the beginning of the story. She's basically making a living by abusing her powers to travel between realms to kind of sell her powers to people. And I could write short stories in that. So I don't know how.
We don't actually know what happens to Myra, really, do we? That there are suggestions as to what happens to her, but there's nothing definitive, is there? In the same way that there is with your character, Simon, with your aged wizard.
Maureen. Yeah, well, I was going to say that. I mean, although he was nominally my character, he kind of really grew on me and acquired some emotional depth. And I would like to write more stories about him. And you mentioned the Shadow Labyrinth. He does wander into it, and you assume he sacrificed himself, but it's never spelled out. So if we wanted, when Phil gets around to marshalling the next one, he could wander out and pop out anywhere. be grumpy in some other realm, you know. So
Yeah, I'm just making a note actually for my counsellor for next week. I've got to talk about this.
But yeah, I think I my only thing worrying about it would be how much of about writing separate stories, and this would be how much of the world would be required to know. It might work, but I wonder if these are the kind of things that require people to have read the whole novel first to kind of try and get it. Maybe not.
Yeah.
I must admit, I'm fascinated by the Shadow Labyrinth idea. I mean, for me, because Portal Fantasy has always been a big part of my writing, that sort of realm between the realms, as it were, has got all sorts of possibilities as a world in itself. And so I think there's all sorts of things that you could do there that, you know, allow characters to pop in and out as and whenever you want them to, that aren't, you know, that may be perceived as dead but actually aren't, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. I think what you wouldn't want to do for a sequel is to say, "But Devouring came back" or whatever, you know.
Oh no.
I'm not doing that.
No, we're not doing that. And he's also not coming out of the shower either.
Is that a Dallas reference?
That is a Dallas reference.
Oh God, you youngsters!
Checking.
Phil, what about you? Are there any characters you might want to, you know, revisit?
It would have been tricky with our ones because it was quite fun. We did quite a lot of backstory. I don't know if the other teams did, but in our one, I kicked it off by just writing a big long section about. So I started with Yaz. I don't even the main character. I don't know how she pronounces her name. But I wrote a big long sort of backstory of what sort of person she is, so that we would all have something to go off. And we had these backstories, but kind of the focus with both Nikki and Yaz really was that they weren't really very effective at what they did. They were kind of useless people who were thrown into this situation. And given how the story goes, there's not much to follow up there, because their background, if you wanted to do a prequel, it wouldn't be a very exciting prequel. So there's certainly peripheral stories that you could lock in there. I mean, there's a whole aspect to it that I don't think we really touched on hugely in the story overall, that the whole Realm Raiders thing was supposed to be, at least originally, and I don't know how much of it really came in the end, that there was supposed to be a kind of peripheral element to it, that this is, you know, generational tasks that have been handed down, and that presumably there would be other adventurers and whole families passing this through. And that was part of, I think I touched on it very briefly with the first Yaz chapter, which was never really revisited much because it wasn't really relevant in the way the story went. But there was that idea that there could be a massive, wider, almost conspiracy surrounding this whole affair. So there were directions that it could go in. Certainly, it's a very niche world.
Yeah, I think we didn't follow that very far, did we, in the story?
But I was happy at least to see, as I think you were mentioning before, about Simon's chapter where they start actually jumping through the different realms. I think it's Simon's second chapter, and that really gets into that element of where it could go and all the different directions you could take. It was nice to see that.
Yeah.
I think that was one of my favorite aspects of it, was just having all these different worlds. I quite enjoyed just seeing those different worlds and being able to kind of write a chapter in one world and be like, right, we never have to go back there again.
Don't have to explain that.
Yeah, exactly. Although, you know, I did enjoy just thinking about these kind of settings. It was just nice to, but also for the second chapter, I can think of something completely different, and that's absolutely fine. And then that was I really enjoyed that. So we are probably going to wrap up relatively soon, as there is another panel coming along shortly, or live panel as well. So our last thing we want to, of our topics to talk about, is what surprised you the most. So I think we'll go through that, and then maybe also think about if there's anybody else who's thinking of doing a collaborative writing project, if there's any advice you might have for them beyond. Think about it very carefully, whether or not you do want to do that, because it could be a lot of work. But from the Realm Raiders project, whether it's the stories or the story itself, or I guess the back end of the project, what surprised you the most about it? that we might not have already touched on? I'll just throw that to the room.
I was so surprised how easy it was, actually, in terms of when Phil suggested this. I did wonder whether this was going to, trying to write with 8 other writers was going to be quite a lot of hard work to try and get it all to work together. But in fact, it really wasn't. We had quite a few.
Not for us.
Yeah, it may have been harder for Phil.
For someone, maybe.
But when I was writing it, we met up occasionally. We exchanged messages and so on about it. But in general, it wasn't that complicated for us because we were we were able to just kind of you take a story thread and you dash it out, and in some ways, there's a lot of freedom to knowing that someone else is going to take over and they're going to do something with your character. You have no control what they're going to do. So you're kind of a lot freer than when you're writing in some way your own stuff, where you have to think about the consequences of the things you do, right, Simon? It's like just dumping the problem on someone else.
I'm sorry about that. It all worked out. The thing that surprised me, and this harks back to how I write books, because as I say, I think of a beginning and an end, and then I just move from A to B. The thing that surprised me was that people thought halfway through, why don't we change B? Why don't we make the goodies the baddies? And I'm like, what? You can't. Why don't we make the baddies the goodie? The goodies could be baddies, and some of them could be goodies pretending to be baddies. And I'm like, so that was.
It get complicated at one stage, didn't it? Although I think we simplified it eventually, but
yes,
I think it all worked.
Yeah, but I think the person organising it, as Phil knows, probably gets the hardest job out of it and the least credit. Probably it's they've got to. They're coordinating everything, whereas the rest of us are just throwing problems.
I know nothing about classical music, and so I'm one of those people who thinks the conductor is just standing there waving a stick. But in fact, Phil was doing that and kind of obviously keeping everybody in time and in sync and making sure the right things happened at the right times. It turns out that's quite important, Phil. You need to wave the stick around more.
Any other surprises from the film?
I would echo what I said before. The thing that surprised me was how it came together so smoothly, not just in terms of the workload, which is exactly as Patrick was saying, it's true, but also in terms of the story. And we've said that on the overall level, it was interesting how everything came together. It was interesting for us very early on, even between me, Damon, and Derek. We were going in thinking we were going to end up with 3 chapters that were completely different, and it was surprising just when we first read each of our first chapters that they were just very similar in tone. And I guess a lot of that was because of the way we'd been talking about it beforehand, because we could obviously, we set a tone by discussing it, and it came out in a particular manner, which was interesting to see.
I think there was also certainly, to start at the beginning, an element of organisation to that as well, because I think Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, when we were doing the original organisations, I think we grouped certainly Derek and Damien together, as their writing styles were relatively similar, and I think that had been an element for some of the other chapters. Like I think my writing style can be a bit gritty as well, not as dark as Frank's, but I think that's we went together for that reason. So yeah, I think that was also nice that everyone did fit together so well, and I think that was given some consideration.
It also we applied the criteria that often happens when you're in meetings, and that is that whoever's not there gets the shit job. And that happened quite a lot. I remember it was really case. I've forgotten which one of the 9 people it was who said, "I'm never missing one of these meetings ever again." Which I think was very, very wise. And for me, just very, very briefly, I enjoyed the whole process immensely. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed it. one of them, I'm going to get very philosophical here, so just forgive me for a second, and I promise just 2 minutes. But for me, it was about the fact that I think that when you're a writer, you're constantly looking to improve, aren't you? You're looking to enlarge your skill base, if you like, and to develop as a writer. And what I think a number of people have said, but it's certainly true for me, was that the whole process taught me a huge amount of useful information about how to write, how to create characters, how to plot, and so on, because I was just listening to what everybody else was saying and thinking, oh, that's a really good idea. I would never have thought about doing that. Oh, that's an interesting character. And now that another person's taken it, they've shifted the emphasis slightly, and they've done that. And the result of that thing that I think everybody did, which was, to drop the previous author into, sort of a real pile of excrement on the basis of, I can't think what to happen next, so that I'm going to leave that to you. And that is a wonderful, because we've all been there as authors, haven't we? That's what we all find ourselves doing on a regular basis. But it's just great that other people are doing the same thing. So for me, it was an affirming exercise that I gained a huge amount from. So I'm so pleased that we did it. Really pleased.
Yeah, and it was kind of that thing of dropping the end. It's the way my wife writes mainly. Is she always gets to the end of a scene or chapter with kind of what's the worst thing that could happen now, or to the characters. And the freeing thing about this, of course, is you say, what's the worst thing that could happen here, and you don't have to solve it. In some ways it encourages you, though, because it encourages you to, because if you're putting your characters in a situation thinking, shit, I've got to solve that in the next chapter, maybe you'll modify a bit. But if you're thinking someone else has got to solve that in the next chapter, then maybe you really will go full in on where you're leaving, which makes it kind of a better read in many ways, because the readers are now also thinking, how the hell are they getting out of that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we are coming up to our time, so there's going to be another panel on shortly. So does anyone have any brief advice then for anybody who might want to embark on this kind of collaborative writing process? Any just sort of brief thoughts that you might have for authors or people who would want to organize it as well. I'll throw that out to the room.
Don't be precious, basically. Just you might love your character, you might love your plot line. Don't love it, but be willing to let it go. And if someone else has a better idea, go with that idea.
And I'd just expand on that. So be open to everything as well. Be open to doing something different. Taking that.
Patrick spoke about TV script writers. I think is really relevant as well. You need to have someone who pulls it all together and is sort of prepared to have awkward conversations if that's necessary. I didn't, I'm pleased to say, but just needs to keep everybody on track because that is crucial.
I think it's also important to have someone who's going to follow through as well, because often these things people will realize how much work it is in the middle and give up on it. And it's important to have someone who's really willing to keep going, not just do a bit of it.
Yeah. And has time as well, I have to say.
So I think it probably helps that we all kind of know each other. So if you found 9 random writers who didn't really have any emotional investment in the other 8, then that might not work so well, I suppose. We all pretend to get along, so.
and it's also, as well as coming up with a story, it's a good way of creating community and getting to know other writers, because although all of us knew some of the other writers, I don't know if anyone other than Phil knew everybody who was taking part in this. And it was nice to meet new people and work with them on writing and other ideas from that. And you wouldn't necessarily get this in other ways.
True. Absolutely. Well, I think we'll draw this lovely conversation to a close now. But thank you again for everybody to having this lovely discussion about collaborative writing and going through the Realm Raiders project again. If you haven't read it, please do go check it out. It's hosted on Spotlight Indie, and you can go and find that. Hopefully, you won't be too annoyed with the spoilers that we have thrown here, but also it's been out for a little while, so hopefully you won't mind too much. So to pull this together, don't remember that this is part of Spotlight Indie's big indie weekend. So we've got a load of other panels coming up in a moment. On the hour, we're going to have a live panel for No Such Thing as a Stupid Question. So go and check that out. I'm going to be on that as well, probably wearing different clothes. It's just the magic of editing and the internet. And don't forget as well, later that we're going to have a live launch party for Phil Parker for his latest British Bureau of the Arcane work. So please do go and join for that. Otherwise, just thank you again to everybody here. So I'm going to go around again clockwise and just ask everybody to plug themselves, plug their books, let everybody know where they can find you, and they will come and follow you and buy your books. I am absolutely sure. Simon, where can people find you and your books?
SimonKewin.co.uk is probably the easiest place. All my books are on there, and then links to social media stuff. But yeah, my name is slightly hard to spell, but it's written on the screen. So
it's written on the screen, so
that's fine. Good. And it's right as well.
Excellent. Patrick, where can people find you and your books?
Yeah, it's my website, patricksamphire.com. All of my books are on there with links to all of them, and so are all my short stories with links to where you can read them. And I am on various social media, but I often rant on social media. So if you're not into ranting, then just go to the website.
That is true.
Phil, where can people find you and your stuff?
I'm phil-williams.co.uk. You've got all of my books on there. There's quite a lot of them, so you can choose whatever is most interesting. I'm also, I'm on social media, but not very interesting on there, so I wouldn't bother looking up that. And, I've got a copy of my latest book, is the A Winter's Mercy, coming out in the Blood Scout series in a couple of weeks, and that's that's it.
Perfect. And Phil Parker, where can people find you and your book?
Thank you, Phil. You just reminded me. I also got. Oh, look! Look what I produced here. I'm Phil Parker. You can find me on social media with Phil Speculates. My website is Phil Parker at the Speculative Faction. And if you would like to get a copy of my fantasy noir series, the third and final one is out on the 3rd of October, which is when the launch party is taking place. So thank you very much, everyone.
Which is today. When this goes out.
Which is today, yeah.
Literally released today. Yes. Time is a magic thing.
Time's relative.
So just leave me with a thank you again to all of our lovely panelists. You can find Spotlight Indie at spotlightindie.co.uk, Spotlight Indie on the socials, and obviously on this very YouTube channel that you're watching this on. So do stick around for all the other lovely panels we've got for Spotlight Indie's big indie weekend, and we've got live panels for the rest of for today, and more coming across the weekend. So do check it out. So again, thank you so much to everybody, and we will see you soon. So bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.